Go away. This place is not for poor people like you. Get out." The harsh words were followed by the sound of footsteps and the doors of the supermarket slamming shut. The boy, who was only 12 years old, silently made a vow that one day the whole city would know his name. Nam had been through hardships most people couldn't even imagine. Orphaned at a young age, he and his grandmother depended on each other in a fragile house between the busy city streets. Every day, his work began before dawn, with his small feet trudging along rough roads to push his old bread cart through bustling neighborhoods. He passed by bright lights and lavish displays, but never felt their warmth. In those places, Nam was nothing more than a shadow, a boy ignored by all. The bread cart wasn't just his livelihood, it was his only hope, the means by which he could provide for his frail grandmother lying in bed. Every time he saw her in pain, he would silently remind himself not to give up. If he could just sell all the bread that day, he would have enough money to buy more medicine for her. But life wasn't kind to the poor. On rainy days, he huddled under a thin raincoat, protecting the bread from getting wet. On slow sales days, he went hungry, saving every penny for his grandmother. Sometimes he was chased away, humiliated, but Nam never stopped looking for a glimmer of hope in the cold, indifferent eyes around him. He never blamed fate nor envied the children his age who could go to school. He only wished that one day his grandmother would be well again and that he could give her a proper meal. But fate seemed to test him more than ever, as the warm rays of life remained just out of his reach. One day, Nam stopped his old bread cart in front of a large supermarket. The bright lights and the throngs of people made him feel so small. He knew this place was different from the alleys and back streets where he usually sold his bread, but today, the money he had left wasn't enough to buy medicine for his grandmother. He had no choice but to try his luck here. Fresh bread, only 2,000 dong a loaf. Nam's voice barely rose above the noise of the city. He tried his best to offer his bread, but no one stopped. He watched the people, dressed in fine clothes, walk by him with looks of disdain. His hope slowly faded as a woman emerged from the supermarket, a bag of goods in hand. Nam hurried over. "Excuse me, could you buy a loaf of bread?" "Just 2,000 dong." Before the woman could respond, a large man appeared from inside the store. It was Mr. Hung, the supermarket's security chief. His cold face and displeased eyes fixed on Nam. "What are you doing here? Who gave you permission to stand in front of the supermarket?" Mr. Hung's voice boomed, making Nam step back in shock. "I am just selling bread. I haven't done anything wrong, sir," Nam stammered, but Mr. Hung interrupted, pushing the bread cart so hard it tipped over. The loaves of bread fell to the ground, scattered across the white tiles of the supermarket. Nam knelt down, trembling, picking up each loaf, wiping off the dust. "I'm sorry, sir. I just need money to buy medicine for my grandmother. Please, don't chase me away," he pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion, tears mixing with sweat on his dirty face. But Mr. Hung only yelled, "Go away. This place isn't for poor people like you." Nam tried to hold back tears as he bent down, pulling his cart away. The passers-by, cold and indifferent, didn't stop to help. To them, the poor boy was just a fleeting inconvenience in their busy day. As Nam walked away, his heart ached for the dirty loaves that no one wanted. But in his eyes, there was still a spark of determination. He promised himself that one day, he wouldn't have to endure this anymore. He silently pushed the cart to a quiet corner far from the supermarket, his heart heavy. The bread was ruined, no one wanted to buy it, and his grandmother's condition was worsening. He lowered his head, tears rolling down his face, but his feet kept moving because he knew that stopping meant his grandmother wouldn't get her medicine. As he was about to leave, a middle-aged woman emerged from the supermarket. It was Mrs. Hoa, elegant and warm-eyed. She had seen everything from a distance and couldn't bear to watch the boy being humiliated. She walked over and gently said, "How many loaves do you have left?" "Sell them all to me." Nam looked up, his eyes still red. "But the bread is dirty." "I can't sell it," he replied hesitantly. Mrs. Hoa smiled and said, "It's fine. I'm not buying because of the bread, but because you deserve help." Not only did she buy all the bread, but she also handed Nam a large bill, much more than the bread was worth. Nam's eyes widened in confusion. "I can't accept so much," he said. Mrs. Hoa smiled and interrupted, "Take it. This is a reward for your hard work. But remember, hard work alone isn't enough. You must have faith and dreams. One day you will achieve something greater." Nam, choking back tears, accepted the money, bowing deeply to thank her. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of justice and warmth from humanity. As Mrs. Hoa disappeared into the crowd, Nam looked at his now empty cart, but his heart was full of hope. He promised himself that her words would be the motivation to continue, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. In the days that followed, Nam felt as though he had found a small light in the darkness. Mrs. Hoa's words echoed in his mind every time he pushed his bread cart through crowded streets. "You must have faith and dreams." Nam began to believe that with hard work, everything could change. But life, it seemed, wasn't going to give him much time to hold on to that hope. One morning, after a long night of selling bread, Nam returned home to find his grandmother breathing heavily. She tried to smile weakly, but Nam could immediately tell that she was hiding the pain in her chest. "Grandmother, let me take you to the clinic," he said, panic in his voice, but she shook her head. "Where's the money for treatment, my dear?" she asked. Nam looked around their empty house. Most of the money Mrs. Hoa had given him had been used to buy medicine in the past days. A wave of anxiety washed over him, but he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to lose his grandmother, the only family he had left. The next day, Nam doubled his efforts. He not only sold bread, but also took on other odd jobs, washing dishes, running errands, even helping at small shops. He didn't turn down any work as long as it meant earning money. His small hands became calloused, but he never complained. Sometimes, as he pushed his cart past the supermarket where he had been humiliated, he would stop for a moment, his gaze drifting up to the brightly lit sign. He silently promised himself that one day, he would walk into that place, not with empty hands, but with a different position. However, Nam's efforts were not enough to outrun time. One night, his grandmother's health worsened, more dangerously than before. Nam stayed awake all night beside her bed, holding her frail hand. The light from the oil lamp cast a worried shadow on his face, and he spent the whole night regretting not being able to earn enough money, blaming fate for being so cruel to them. But when the sun rose the next morning, Nam got up and continued his journey to survive. He was more determined than ever. No longer just thinking of today, he began dreaming about tomorrow. One day, when the sun had just risen, Nam, with his old bread cart, passed through the crowded market. The long hours of hard work had made his hands rough, but his eyes remained as determined as they had been from the start. In Nam's heart, the image of his grandmother remained his greatest motivation to keep going. At the corner of the market, Nam stopped near an old bakery where people often came to buy delicious, fresh bread in the mornings. The owner of the bakery was Mr. Lamb, a man in his 50s, humble in appearance, yet with sharp eyes. He stood in front of the counter, observing the flow of people passing by. Nam hesitantly approached, his voice soft. "Good morning, sir. I sell bread here. Could you please buy for me?" Mr. Lamb turned to look at Nam for a while, and instead of responding right away, he asked, "Where do you make this bread?" Nam replied nervously, "I buy it from a small bakery. I just sell it to make money to support my grandmother." Noticing Nam's sincerity and hardworking demeanor, Mr. Lamb didn't answer immediately. After a moment of thought, he unexpectedly asked, "If I teach you how to make bread, would you like to learn?" Nam's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really, sir? But He hesitated, knowing he couldn't leave his bread cart to learn the craft without earning money right away. Mr. Lamb seemed to understand Nam's hesitation. He smiled lightly and said, "You don't have to learn everything at once. I'll let you help me in the shop, learn as you work, and I'll pay you enough to take care of your grandmother." For Nam, this was an opportunity he had never imagined. He had always known simple labor jobs, but this was a chance to learn a real trade. Without much thought, he nodded in agreement. From that day on, Nam started working at Mr. Lam's bakery. In the mornings, he helped with sales, cleaning, and organizing the ingredients. In the afternoons, when there were fewer customers, Mr. Lam taught him the basics: kneading dough, managing the fire, and selecting ingredients. Nam was not only hardworking, but also quick and smart. He listened attentively to Mr. Lam's instructions, remembering every little detail. Sometimes, Mr. Lam even taught him things beyond baking, like how to calculate costs and how to serve customers with care. A bakery is not just a place to sell food, it's a place that brings joy to the customers, Mr. Lam once told him. Those words became etched in Nam's mind, opening up new perspectives on the future. Nam wasn't just learning to survive day by day, he was starting to dream about opening his own bakery. From the diligent boy he once was, Nam now carried within him a stronger desire than ever before. 10 years passed. Nam had become a grown man, no longer the poor boy selling bread. Wearing a sharp suit, he walked confidently into a large conference room. On the table was the logo of Nam Mat, clearly symbolizing one of the largest supermarket chains in the city. Reflecting on his journey, Nam was deeply moved. After years of apprenticing under Mr. Lam, he not only learned to bake, but also gained a deep understanding of business management. When Mr. Lam's bakery faced difficulties, Nam helped find solutions, from changing the business strategy to promoting products, leading to stable revenue. Nam didn't stop at baking. With the small savings he had accumulated and emotional support from Mr. Lam, he opened his first store, a small grocery store specializing in organic food. Thanks to its reputation and dedicated service, the store became increasingly popular. Step by step, Nam expanded, opening more branches. His name, Nam Mat, gradually became a familiar brand in the city. Even after achieving great success, Nam never forgot his hardships. He often reminded himself that he had once been at the bottom of society, and it was his hard work, trust, and the people who helped him that brought him to where he was. Nam Mat was different from other supermarkets. At his stores, no one was rejected or looked down upon because of their poverty. The working-class people could buy goods at discounted prices, and there were even charity programs to assist them. Nam believed that success was not just for personal gain, it was a way to repay life. In his spacious office, Nam opened a small wooden cabinet and took out an old keepsake, a wooden sign from his old bread cart. It read, "Hot bread, 2000 VND per loaf." Time had faded the letters, but Nam smiled softly, remembering the days he stood in the rain selling bread, the times he was kicked out of the supermarket, and the encouraging gaze of Mrs. Hoa. But most of all, Nam remembered his grandmother, who had passed away a few years ago. Her image, lying weakly in bed, but always encouraging him to keep going, had become the strength that kept Nam from giving up. Nam stood up, adjusted his tie, and looked through the large glass window. The city below was as lively as ever, but for him, everything had changed. He was no longer the boy who had been looked down upon. He was a successful businessman, someone who had turned the hardships of the past into the motivation to change the future. Nam stepped down from his black car. His calm face hid deep thoughts, and in front of him stood the very supermarket where, 10 years ago, the poor boy had been kicked out just for trying to sell bread to buy medicine for his grandmother. All those painful memories came rushing back, but now Nam returned with a completely different stance. After many years of success with his Nam Mat supermarkets, Nam decided to buy the old supermarket, not just for its commercial value, but also for its personal significance. He wanted to turn the place that had once hurt him into a symbol of change and compassion. Today, the new supermarket, renamed Nam M Center, held a grand opening. A large sign outside read, "Welcome, no matter rich or poor." This simple message made the working people in the area feel respected and welcomed, something they had never thought possible. Nam entered, and every corner of the place had been completely transformed. Gone were the cold lights and the distant atmosphere. The supermarket was now filled with laughter and warmth. The shelves were neat and tidy, without being overly luxurious, and the staff warmly greeted customers without discrimination or contempt. Nam walked to a small corner near the entrance, the same place where, years ago, he had been shoved, and his bread cart overturned. He paused, his eyes briefly contemplative. For many, this might have been just an ordinary moment, but for Nam, it marked a turning point in his life. Not long after, an employee approached Nam and whispered, "Everything is ready, sir." Nam nodded and stepped onto a small stage set up in the middle of the supermarket. The lights shone brightly on the hundreds of people from the neighborhood who had gathered to celebrate the grand opening. Nam took the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He recognized some familiar faces from the past, those who had once ignored him or even looked down on him. He quietly turned his back when he was humiliated. But instead of blaming, Nam just smiled. Welcome, everyone, to this place today. Nam MT Center is not just a supermarket, but a place for everyone, regardless of whether you are poor or rich. 10 years ago, I stood here with empty hands and the eyes of a boy selling bread. And today, I return not to revisit the pain, but to share a story of hope, perseverance, and kindness. Nam's words echoed through the space, and the listeners were deeply moved. Some poor laborers in the crowd nodded, their eyes filled with pride and gratitude as applause rang out across the hall. Nam smiled and left the stage, standing in a corner, quietly watching the people coming in and out of the supermarket. There were no more cold stares, no more indifference. Nam felt that, at last, he had turned his painful memories into lessons and had left a higher value in this place. The day after the grand opening, Nam returned to Nam M Center to check on the supermarket's operations. As soon as he stepped into the management office, he heard a soft knock. A staff member entered and spoke quietly, "Sir, there is an elderly person who would like to meet you. He is sitting at the reception desk." Curious, Nam walked out to the front hall. From a distance, he saw a middle-aged man, thin with slightly hunched shoulders, his face full of wrinkles. His hands tightly clutched an old hat, and his eyes hesitated, looking around as if waiting for something. Nam was stunned. Although time had passed, he instantly recognized him. It was Mr. Hung, the security guard who had once kicked him out of the supermarket. But now, Mr. Hung no longer had the stern or authoritative look he once had. His face showed signs of fatigue, worry, and a bit of embarrassment. When Mr. Hung saw Nam, he quickly stood up, bowed his head, and said, "Hello, I heard this supermarket is hiring security staff. I'm old now, but I can still do light work. Please give me a chance." Nam remained silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Old memories rushed back, the image of Mr. Hung knocking over his bread cart, the loaves rolling on the ground, and the harsh words from that time. But Nam didn't let his emotions take over. He looked at Mr. Hung, who was now frail and no longer held any power. After a while, Nam softly said, "Come in, let's sit and talk for a moment." Inside the room, Nam listened to Mr. Hung's story. It turned out that after quitting his job at the old supermarket, Mr. Hung had faced difficulties in his life, family troubles, declining health, and age, which made it hard for him to find a job. Mr. Hung spoke sincerely, his eyes full of pleading. Nam quietly nodded and called in the HR staff to arrange a suitable security job for Mr. Hung. He also asked them to help him find temporary accommodation in the staff dormitory. Once everything was settled, Mr. Hung stood up, bowed deeply, and thanked Nam. But before he left, he turned around and looked at Nam. His eyes were hesitant. "Sir, I think we've met somewhere before, right?" Nam just smiled and didn't respond. He didn't want to bring up the past, not because he had forgotten, but because he knew that forgiveness was the best way to close a painful chapter. That evening, Nam stood on the stage at the main hall of Nam M Center, surrounded by hundreds of people, residents, staff, and even old customers from the supermarket. The lights from the ceiling shone down, but it was Nam's story that truly captivated the audience. He began in a calm but emotional voice. 10 years ago, I stood at the door of this supermarket, not as an owner, but as a poor boy selling bread. At that time, I only hoped to earn enough money to buy medicine for my grandmother. But what I received was disdain and pain. Today, I return here not to blame, but to tell everyone that, even in the greatest difficulties in life, perseverance and belief can change everything. The room was silent as everyone listened. Some bowed their heads, reflecting on their past mistakes in how they treated the poor. Nam continued, "Success does not come from one person. I received kindness from people I never expected, like Mrs. Hoa, who helped me when I was desperate. Those things taught me that we don't live just for ourselves, but to spread kindness to others." A round of applause echoed, but Nam didn't stop. He smiled and added, "I want this supermarket to be for everyone, those who have been rejected, those who have felt they have no place here. No one will be discriminated against. Whoever you are, you will be accepted here." Nam's final words were a message to the crowd. If you are facing difficulties, believe in yourself. Every road has a light as long as you don't give up. And if you can, help others when they need it, because sometimes a small action from you can change a life. After the speech, the applause rang through the hall. Nam stepped down from the stage and walked into the crowd, no longer separated from his customers. The story ended with Nam standing at the entrance of Nam M Center, looking up at the sky with a contented smile. For him, the past was not just pain, but the motivation to build a meaningful future. And if this story has touched you, please subscribe to the channel to help us spread more touching and human stories like this.